Well, the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew has something that we don't usually read. It's a genealogy. And when you are reading the Bible and you run into a genealogy, a whole list of lineage of somebody, we sort of skip it and go on something beyond that. And I confess to you that I have usually skipped the one in the first chapter of Matthew. It is the genealogy of Jesus. And yet, although we've skipped it for years and thought it's unimportant, it says something very strong and very powerful to us. Genealogies to the Jews was very important because they proved one thing, pure Jewish blood. And by that genealogy, they proved that we were pure Jews as far back as we go. There are no Gentiles and there are no foreign blood within our veins. That was the purpose of the genealogy. You see it in Genesis and you see it all through the Bible. And then we get to the one of Jesus. His genealogy in the first chapter of Matthew, and something really weird happens. Indeed, Matthew says he is a descendant of Abraham. He is a descendant of David, He really has great Jews in his background back to the beginning of the race. And then, boy, does something unusual happen. He drops 4 women into the genealogy. His mother is there, and that's unusual enough, but he drops 4 other women in there. That you don't do. That's a no-no. Women were never included in genealogies. Because you know what the prayer of most Jewish men was every morning? I thank thee, God, I was not born a Gentile, a slave, a dog, or a woman. That was his prayer. Average Jew every morning. And here is Matthew dropping into the genealogy of Jesus 4 women. And let me tell you, they're not just women. They are really different women. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute, went in to seduce her father-in-law that she might have children by. Rahab was a prostitute that God used to help overthrow Jericho. Ruth was a Moabite, and we read the story of Ruth and we think it was very beautiful. The Moabites in the law of Moses were described as being below the scale. And Ruth was really very aggressive for her time. We see the beauty in the story, but there's something else in the story also that we probably overlook most of the time. That's how aggressive she was to her husband's brother after her husband's death. But a Moabite. Moses spoke disparagingly of the Moabites. And then Bathsheba, a Hittite. No Jew. We know what she and David did. We know all about them. And here comes Matthew with that group of women being named in Jesus' background. He did it deliberately. He could have put forth all kind of great Jewish women in the Bible, but he didn't. He deliberately chose those 4 women to say something very powerful to us. And we've jumped the genealogy all these years and missed it. He wanted us to understand that Jesus comes into our world to break all the barriers down. He comes into our world to transcend everything and everybody. Not only did he come for sinners, Matthew is saying he came through a bunch of sinners. Understand that. Deliberately, he includes this to make us understand forcefully. He breaks the barriers down. Take them away. The greatest barrier of all is the barrier of our sins that separate us from God and separate us from each other. But he could not in a more powerful manner bring that home to us than to include those 4 people in the background and lineage of Jesus. Albert Speer was Hitler's confidant. During World War II, he kept the factories running under Nazi leadership. Hitler went to Albert Speer about all kinds of advice. When the war was over and the Nuremberg trials took place, there were 24 Nazis on trial there. Albert Speer was the only one on trial who confessed his wrongdoing, who said, yes, I was wrong. I confess what I did. None of the others admitted to anything. Speer spent 20 years in prison. After he got out of prison, he was on Good Morning America one morning. David Hartman was then the host of that program, and he was interviewing Speer, and he said, in your book that you have written about your life, you have said that there is such tremendous guilt in your life that you can never get over that guilt for what you have done. And Speer said, yes, that's correct. He said, I spent 20 years in prison. I wish I could say that that wiped it out. But he said it didn't. It can never wipe out the guilt I feel for what I did. And Hartman said, am I understanding what you are saying? And no matter what happens in your life and what you do, the guilt is still there. And he said, yes. That is a part of my atonement, to carry that guilt around for what I did and the millions of people who suffered because of what I helped do. A writer was listening to the television program that morning, and he said he wanted to sit down, and he fully intended to, and write Albert Speer a letter and say, don't you know about Christ? Don't you know that forgiveness is found at the foot of the cross, even for you? But he said he never wrote the letter. And that was Speer's last public appearance. He died. And this man who saw the agony in his face that morning of his guilt and burden, which you can understand, then felt very badly that he did not write that letter and say, Speer, the burden of guilt can be taken away. Christ has come. A minister who led a retreat for a group of women said that in the retreat one morning, a group of women had gathered in a group to study and to share. And he said one had rheumatoid arthritis. She was a young woman in her mid-30s. She wore a back brace. The arthritis was so bad that during the break she had to leave the meeting and go by herself to just suffer alone for a while. And then she would come back in the meeting when she could. And he said some of the ladies in the meeting told him about her suffering, her brace, her arthritis, how desperately ill she was. And he said one afternoon he sat down with her and they just got to talking, and he said something happened that ordinarily might take months of counseling to happen. He said it was like the Spirit of God was at work, and that Spirit went into high gear. And as he talked with that woman, she started pouring out an experience in her life. When she was 18 years old, active in church, played the piano, there was a new minister. And he came into church one morning or one afternoon when she was practicing, and he came to her and made advances to her. She said it so shook her because he was new. The church had been torn apart by the former minister. Her father was instrumental, chairman of the pulpit committee, who went out and brought this minister in. She couldn't tell anybody. She couldn't do anything. It would have ruined her father, she said, his reputation. People would have said, what did he do bringing this kind of man in here? What was wrong with it? So she shut it up. She shut it up in her life. The bitterness and the resentment grew beyond belief. And she poured all of this out. She said, even now, when they had a prayer time in their church, and people came and knelt with the minister together, she says, I can't go. I can't kneel with a preacher. I can't do that. The hatred and the resentment is so bad. This man said he did something that he did not ordinarily do. to people. Touching is, one must be careful, especially these days. For this woman, he had to be particularly careful. But he felt that her healing had to come through some minister being able to touch her. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder. And he said she shivered. But she didn't draw back. She just shivered. And he said, you are shutting out of your life the joy of Christ because of what somebody did to you years ago and because you can't forgive. She said, I know it. I know that. But I can't help it. I can't. They had a communion service, and before the communion service, everybody pulled off a piece of bread from a common loaf. And then he asked everybody to decide something in their lives that they wanted to die, to do away with, as they held the bread. And then put the bread back. And then they had the communion service, and they said that piece of bread represented that which you wanted to die in your life, to do away with. Then they shared at the communion table.